Detective Supplemental Report P96 21871. First-degree murder. Detective Linda Arndt. Date of the report, January 8, 1997. On December 26 of 1997 at approximately 06:35 hours, I received a phone call at my home phone number from Detective Sergeant Robert Whitson. Sergeant Whitson informed me that officers were on the scene of a reported kidnapping. The reported kidnapping had occurred at 755 15th Street, located in Boulder County, Colorado. JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old female, was reported to have been kidnapped from her home. JonBenét's mother had found a ransom letter inside the home at approximately 05:50 hours this morning. JonBenét had last been seen inside her home at approximately 2200 hours on December 25, 1996. There was no apparent forced entry to the residence. The family members who were inside the home from the night of December 25 through the morning of December 26 had not been harmed. These family members included JonBenét's mother, father, and brother. In the note left by the reported kidnappers, the author of the note stated, the reported kidnappers would phone the Ramseys between 0800 hours and 1000 hours. Sergeant Whitson requested that I respond to the Ramsey address on 15th Street. Sergeant Whitson was going to make attempts to have U.S. West Communications place a trace on all incoming calls placed at the Ramsey home. I went to the Boulder Police Department and obtained a handheld tape recorder as well as my notebook. I met with Detective Fred Patterson at the Boulder Police Department, BPD. Detective Patterson and I responded to the Ramsey address located on 15th Street. While at the BPD, I briefly met with BPD Officer Carl Veach. Officer Veach informed me that he had the ransom note, which had been left by the reported kidnappers. I requested that Officer Veach make 3 copies of this note. This request was carried out. I retained possession of one of the copies of the note. Another copy was given to Detective Patterson, and the third copy was placed in a sealed envelope and left on my desk. I quickly reviewed the contents of this 3-page note. Detective Patterson and I then responded to the Ramsey residence. Prior to arriving at the residence, we met with Watch 3 Sergeant Paul Reichenbach. We met with Sergeant Reichenbach at the rear of the Base Mars Shopping Center at approximately 07:55 hours. Sergeant Reichenbach personally provided us with the following additional information. After officers had been dispatched to this call, all further communication was done by telephone rather than radio traffic. The first officer on the scene was Officer Rick French. Officer French had told Sergeant Reichenbach that something didn't seem right. The 6-year-old daughter of John Ramsey, JonBenét Ramsey, had been kidnapped from her bedroom sometime between approximately 2200 hours on December 25th of 1996 and 600 hours on December 26th of 1996. A 2.5-page note had been found by JonBenét's mother. Demands in this note stated that $118,000 be paid to ensure the safe return of JonBenét. No police or law enforcement were to be notified, otherwise JonBenét would be. The 2.5-page note had been found by JonBenét's mother, Patsy Ramsey, at the bottom of a spiral staircase located in the house. John Ramsey is the president of Access Graphics. This business is located at 1426 Pearl Street in Boulder. This business is very successful. Sergeant Reichenbach said there was a light dusting of snow on the ground when he arrived at the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach did not notice any footprints or other tracks in the snow. Sergeant Reichenbach personally checked the exterior of the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach did not notice any signs of forced entry to the residence. Sergeant Reichenbach had arranged through Boulder Regional Communications Center, BRCC, dispatchers to have a trap placed on the Ramsey home phone number. The home phone number for the John Ramsey residence is 303. Dispatchers had spoken with an employee with U.S. West Communications. The trap was activated and in place by the time Detective Patterson and I arrived at the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach informed me that U.S. West Communications would need a letter of demand on BPD letterhead within 48 hours, explaining the necessity for this trap. Sergeant Reichenbach had informed us that Boulder County Sheriff's Department BCSD Department Scott Williams was a K-9 officer. Deputy Williams was notified that his services may be needed and was placed on standby. Sergeant Reichenbach also suggested that if a bloodhound services were needed, Aurora Police Department might be able to assist. Detective Patterson and I arrived at the Ramsey residence at approximately 0810 hours. I personally met with BPD Officer Rick French. Officer French provided me with a synopsis of who was on the scene and what had already been done. BPD crime scene investigator officers Barry Wise and Sue Barklow were also at the Ramsey residence. Officer Wise was photographing the interior and the exterior of the residence. Officer Barklow was attempting to obtain latent fingerprints. Areas checked included possible points of entry and exit to the residence, as well as the spiral staircase leading from outside JonBenét's room to the first floor, and the door leading into JonBenét's room. Officer French provided me with the following information. Officer French told me that when he arrived, he met with Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother. Patsy was very upset and distraught, and it was difficult for Officer French to obtain information from her. Officer French also spoke with John Ramsey, JonBenét's father. Officer French learned that the Ramsey family had been at a friend's house on the late afternoon and evening of December 25, 1996. They returned home at approximately 2200 hours on December 25. JonBenét and her brother, Burke, went to bed shortly after the family returned home. John Ramsey had read to JonBenét after she'd gone to bed and before she went to sleep. JonBenét had last been seen wearing a red turtleneck and white long underwear. Patsy woke up this morning and discovered the suspected ransom note at the bottom of the spiral staircase. Patsy originally thought that the note may have been left by the housekeeper. Officer French had been told that the Ramsey family had been planning to leave early this morning for Michigan. The Ramsey family has a home in Upper Michigan. After Patsy discovered the note, she went to JonBenét's room. Patsy discovered JonBenét was missing. Officer French told me there was no apparent forced entry to the Ramsey home. Officer French had checked the Ramsey home and had not detected any sign of JonBenét. 4 friends of the Ramseys had been notified by the Ramseys of JonBenét's disappearance and were currently at the house. The pastor from the Ramseys church had also been notified and was also present at the house. BPD victim advocates had been notified and were also present inside the Ramsey home. After I had briefly met with Officer French, I met with John Ramsey. I informed John Ramsey that U.S. West Communications had already placed a trap on incoming phone calls made to his home. I told Mr. Ramsey that I would also like to connect the tape recorder to the incoming phone line. John Ramsey gave me his verbal permission. I asked John Ramsey for the location of the phones in the house, on the first floor. John Ramsey showed me a telephone mounted on the wall at the west end of the kitchen and a telephone located in the den. The den is located west of the kitchen. I connected the tape recorder to the telephone located in the den. I informed Mr. Ramsey that if the author of the suspected ransom note called, we would be able to tape record the conversation. John Ramsey was informed of my actions and gave his verbal consent. After the phone recorder had been connected to the telephone in the den, I instructed John Ramsey on the use of the tape recorder. John Ramsey told me that he would answer the phone for all incoming calls. After the tape recorder had been connected to the telephone, I met with Patsy Ramsey. Patsy was sitting on a chair in the sitting room. This room is located at the southeast corner of the house on the first floor. 2 of Patsy's friends were with her. Patsy spoke softly when she talked to me. At times, Patsy seemed to be staring off into the distance. Patsy seemed to have a vacant look and seemed dazed. Since Patsy was situated in a room at some distance from the den, I had limited contact with her. I asked Officer French to remain with Patsy. I did ask Patsy a few questions and was able to receive some information. The following is information I received from Patsy. Patsy had gotten up on the morning of December 26, 1996, and had gone down the stairs from her bedroom to the kitchen. Patsy used the back west stairway. The back stairway consists of a spiral staircase leading from just outside of JonBenét's room to the northwest corner of the first floor of the house. At the bottom of the spiral staircase, Patsy discovered a 3-page handwritten note, though had been written on legal pad-sized paper. Patsy said she originally thought the note might have been left by her housekeeper. After Patsy looked at the note and read it, she ran to JonBenét's room. JonBenét was missing. I asked Patsy who had keys to her home. Patsy said the woman who was responsible for housekeeping at her home had a key to the home. I asked Patsy if the home had an alarm system, and if the alarm system had been activated on the night of December 25th. Patsy told me that the home does have an alarm system, however, it had not been used for a while. Patsy did tell me that she believed the house had been locked when she and the rest of her family went to bed on the night of December 25th. Patsy said she had not received any suspicious phone calls nor hang-up phone calls in the past few weeks. There had been no unwelcome solicitors nor suspicious persons at the Ramsey home in the past few weeks. Patsy said that she, her husband, JonBenét, and Burke, her 10-year-old son, had planned on leaving Boulder on the morning of December 26th. The family was going to fly to Michigan to spend time at their summer home. I asked Patsy who knew about this trip. Patsy said some of her close friends knew, and the housekeeper knew. Patsy had not arranged for the neighbors or anyone else to watch their home while the Ramsey family was in Michigan. I asked Patsy if she could think of anyone who might be responsible for JonBenét's disappearance. Patsy told me that her housekeeper had asked to borrow money on December 24th. Patsy told me that she had had a Christmas party at her home on December 23rd. Her housekeeper was supposed to clean up from this party on the morning of December 24th. Linda Hoffman had phoned Patsy on the morning of December 24th. Linda Hoffman asked Patsy if she could borrow some money. Patsy said yes. Patsy told me she had loaned the money to her in the past. Linda phoned Patsy again on the afternoon of December 24. She was crying. She said she needed to borrow $2,000. Patsy thought the money was needed for dental repair and for other things with her family. Patsy told her that she would write a check for $2,000. Patsy said she would leave the check on the kitchen counter. Patsy told me that someone was scheduled to be at the Ramsey home on Friday morning, December 27 at 0900 hours. Patsy told me that someone has worked as her housekeeper about the past 2 years. This person cleans the Ramsey's homes twice a week. This person is paid $200 a week. Patsy told me that this person's husband is a handyman. Patsy provided me with this person's husband's name. Patsy also supplied me with this person's home phone number. Patsy further told me that this person has adult children and they have had problems in the past 2 months. Patsy believed that one of her adult daughters had been in contact with Safe House because of domestic violence problems. Patsy did not know the name of this daughter, nor where she lived. Patsy thought the daughter lived somewhere, and Patsy thought that the adult daughter's domestic problems might have occurred prior to Thanksgiving of 1996. After I had spoken briefly with Patsy, I returned to the den area of the house. Each time the telephone rang, I was present when John Ramsey answered the phone. There were at least 3 times when John Ramsey was not present in the den when the phone rang. I personally saw John Ramsey run to the den to answer the phone. For each incoming phone call received at the Ramsey home on the morning of December 26th, John Ramsey told me that the caller was not associated with the suspected ransom note. While I was in the den, the pastor from the local church relayed a message to me. Patsy had told this information to the pastor. I believe the pastor's first name was something. The pastor told me about a telephone conversation Patsy had with her mother. Patsy's mother had spoken with the housekeeper, while Patsy's mother had been living in the Ramsey home. This individual had reportedly said that JonBenét was so cute that someone would kidnap her. I met with Patsy and asked her about her telephone conversation with her mother. Patsy told me that she had spoken to her mother after she had discovered JonBenét was missing. Patsy's mother is someone. Someone lives in Atlanta, GA. Someone had told Patsy that this person had said many times that JonBenét was such a beautiful girl and wasn't blank afraid that someone was going to kidnap her. Patsy supplied me with this person's home phone number. This home phone number is blank. Detective Patterson was going to follow up on information regarding Miss Blank and her family. Detective Patterson was going to attempt to have U.S. West Communications place a trace on Miss Blank's home phone number. Within about the first 20 minutes of arriving at the Ramsey residence, I asked John Ramsey if he would consent to having his office telephones have a trap placed on them. John Ramsey did give his verbal authorization. John Ramsey supplied me with the work number for himself as well as his first assistant. These phone numbers were blank and blank, respectively. Arrangements were made through U.S. West to have a trap placed on these 2 phone lines at Access Graphics. There were 2 cellular phones at the Ramsey house when Detective Patterson and I arrived. These cellular phones were used to make phone calls from the Ramsey residence. The telephone at the Ramsey house was not used to make outgoing phone calls on the morning of December 26th. The cellular phones belonged to John Ramsey and blank. The friends who had been contacted by the Ramseys and who were present with the Ramseys when I arrived were blank and blank and blank and Pastor blank from blank church in Boulder. Burke, the Ramseys' 9-year-old son, had already left the residence when I had arrived. Burke was staying at the blank home located at blank in Boulder. After I had connected the tape recording to the telephone and had briefly met with Patsy Ramsey, I talked with John Ramsey in the den. I talked with John Ramsey about things to say when the authors of the suspected ransom note called. I told John that he should demand to talk to JonBenét. If John Ramsey was going to be given instructions for meeting the purported kidnappers, I instructed John Ramsey to obtain very specific instructions from the caller. John Ramsey was told to say that he would not be able to obtain the money until at least 1700 hours this date. I supplied John Ramsey with a piece of note paper. I had John Ramsey write notes on this piece of paper regarding what to say when the authors of the suspected ransom note phoned. I retained this notebook paper and later placed it into evidence. Item 4LKA. The third item written by John Ramsey was, "Must talk to JB." I'd placed an asterisk by this sentence. Blank, a friend of John Ramsey's, told John Ramsey that he would be able to obtain the ransom amount from his bank. Blank left the Ramsey's residence after I had arrived and met with his banker. Blank returned to the Ramsey's residence prior to about 0930 hours. Blank told me that he had arranged with his banker to have $118,000 in cash available. This amount was available when Blank returned to the Ramsey residence. The amount had been arranged in the denominations demanded in the suspected ransom note. Blank told me he was able to get his amount obtained within approximately 1 hour of notifying his banker. Blank told me that $118,000 is a relatively insignificant amount compared to John Ramsey's wealth. Blank told me that the persons who demanded the ransom note could easily have asked for $10 million and had obtained that amount. Prior to 1,000 hours, I remained in or near the den area of the house. Patsy remained in the front sitting area. The friends of the Ramseys and the pastor divided their time between Patsy and John. John Ramsey paced between the area of the den and the formal dining room. John was usually by himself. I did not see John or Patsy interact with each other. No one in the house made any obvious comment to me that it was after 1,000 hours and the suspected kidnappers had not called. From the time I arrived at the Ramsey house until approximately 1,000 hours, I had a few brief conversations with John. I had asked John if the doors to the house had been locked when the family went to bed last night. John told me that he personally checked all the doors and all the windows in the home this morning. All of the doors and windows were locked. John told me that although the house does have an alarm system, the family has not used the alarm system for months. I asked John who had keys to the residence. John told me his adult son has a key to the house. The son had been in Atlanta since December 15th of 96. The adult son, John Andrew, had been attending college at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Another family member, Patsy's mother, also had a key to the residence. Patsy's mother is currently living in Atlanta, Georgia. I asked John if any keys had been hidden outside the house. John told me there were no hidden keys. I asked John if any keys had been lost or stolen. John told me there had been no stolen or lost house keys. John told me that the housekeeper, blank, did have a key to the house. Blank was the only person living in Colorado who had a key to the residence. John Ramsey told me that he and his family had been at a dinner party held at the blank home on the afternoon and evening of December 25th, 1996. John, Patsy, Burke, and JonBenét had returned home at approximately 2200 hours. John told me that Patsy and Burke immediately went to bed. John had read a book to JonBenét, tucked her into bed, then John went to bed. John said he went to bed at approximately 22:30 hours. John told me that he is the president and CEO of Access Graphics. There was an article in the Boulder Daily Camera newspaper within this past month about Access Graphics. The news article had been written because Access Graphics had just grossed over $1 billion. John told me that Access Graphics has over 300 employees. John told me that Access Graphics resulted from a merger of 3 businesses in the mid-1980s. John Ramsey had been the founder of one of these businesses. John's business had been in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. John informed me that Access Graphics has business offices located in Mexico City, Mexico, and Amsterdam. I asked John if he could think of any past or current employees of Access Graphics who might be responsible for the disappearance of JonBenét. John told me he was not directly responsible for hiring or firing. John talked about the employees at Access Graphics as being all part of a family. John did tell me that there was one employee that he was forced to let go approximately 5 months ago. The name of this employee is blank. John said that blank and his wife, blank, are currently living in Colorado. John told me he had not seen blank since blank left the company. John told me he could not think of anyone with whom he had disagreement with. I asked John which interior lights, if any, were on when he went to bed on the night of December 25th. John told me no interior lights were on when he went to bed. I asked John which exterior lights were on when he went to bed. John told me that he didn't know if any exterior lights were on. John said the Christmas lights located in the front of the house may have been left on and possibly an exterior light. There are small white Christmas lights lining the sides of the sidewalk, extending toward the front of the house. These Christmas lights were on when I first arrived at the Ramsey residence. After blank had been named as a possible suspect. After blank had been named as a possible suspect, I asked John if he had any photos of blank in that house. After John had been named as a possible After blank had been named as a possible suspect, I asked John if he had any photos of blank in the house. John Ramsey told me that he had a roll of film in his camera. Pictures had been taken of the Christmas party held at the Ramsey home on December 23rd. After blank had been named as a possible suspect. After blank had been named as a possible suspect, I asked John if he had any photos of blank in the house. John Ramsey told me that he had a roll of film in his camera. Pictures had been taken of the Christmas party held at the Ramsey home on December 23rd. John told me that blank had attended that party. I asked John for the film from that camera. John personally provided me with the film from that camera. I gave the roll of 35mm film to Officer Barry Wise. I instructed Officer Wise to have the file developed ASAP. After blank had been named as a possible suspect, I asked John if he had any photos of blank in the house. John Ramsey told me that he had a roll of film in his camera. Pictures had been taken of the Christmas party held at the Ramsey home on December 23rd. John told me that blank had attended that party. I asked John for the film from that camera. John personally provided me with the film from that camera. I gave the roll of 35mm film to Officer Barry Weiss. I instructed Officer Barry Weiss to have the film developed ASAP. I asked John if he had any paperwork in the house which might contain blank's handwriting. John checked the kitchen area for any note, but did not locate any. I asked John if he had canceled checks which had been endorsed by blank. John phoned his bank. John was told that the bank did have copies of checks which had been written to and endorsed by blank. I asked John to have his bank fax those checks to me in care of the fax number located at the BPD Detective Bureau. This fax number is 303 blank. I asked John and Patsy for current photos of JonBenét. I explained that the photos would be copied and distributed to local law enforcement agencies. I was given 2 8x10 photographs of JonBenét as well as an 8x10 portfolio of JonBenét containing 2 pictures and her physical description. I gave these photos to Officer Barry Weiss and instructed him to have copies made and to relay the copies to Sergeant Larry Mason at the Boulder Police Department. Officer Weiss and Officer Barklow cleared the Ramsey residence at approximately 10:15 hours. At an unknown time between approximately 0900 hours and 0945 hours, Detective Sergeant Robert Whitson arrived at the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Whitson talked with John Ramsey in the den area of the house. I was present during part of this conversation. Sergeant Whitson informed John Ramsey that the FBI had been notified and was assisting in this investigation. Sergeant Whitson told John Ramsey that he would need a sample of his handwriting. John verbally agreed to supply Sergeant Whitson with the handwriting sample. Shortly after Sergeant Whitson had requested this sample, John Ramsey wrote a line on a legal pad in front of him and signed his name to this pad. I was sitting next to John Ramsey when he wrote this. John has written, "Now is the time for all people," then signed his name. I removed this sheet of paper from the legal pad, secured it in my notebook, and later placed it in the evidence item 4LKA. Before Officer Barry Weiss left, I asked him to show me what areas of the house had been processed for evidence. The first floor glass door located on the north side of the house, east of the spiral staircase, had been processed for latent fingerprints. John Ramsey had told me that this was the only door in the house that did not have a deadbolt to secure it. The spiral staircase located at the northwest corner of the house, extending from the first floor to the second floor, was processed for latent fingerprints. There was a green Christmas garland covering the handrail portion of the staircase. At the top of the spiral staircase was an open laundry area. JonBenét's bedroom door was located south of this laundry area. Officer Weiss walked to the patio door located at the south end of JonBenét's bedroom. Officer Weiss told me that there had been frost on the patio when officers had arrived. The frost had not been disturbed. Detective Patterson had entered JonBenét's bedroom. I walked into JonBenét's bedroom only as far as the first bed. I did not touch anything. Officer Weiss pointed out a bedroom located west of JonBenét's bedroom. I entered into this bedroom a few steps but did not touch anything. Officer Weiss then walked east along the second floor hallway into the children's playroom area. I noticed that there was a life-size Barbie doll standing next to the north window. Doll was not clothed. Continue east down this hallway. There is a bathroom located on the north side of the hallway and a smaller bedroom located across from this bathroom. At the east end of the hallway is Burke's bedroom. Outside of Burke's bedroom is a stairway leading upstairs to the master bedroom. The stairway also leads downstairs to the front door. I walked upstairs into the master bedroom. I did not touch anything in the master bedroom area. I returned to the second floor using the west steps. The west steps enter the second floor area just east of JonBenét's bedroom and just east of the open laundry area. Sergeant Whitson requested that the door to JonBenét's room be sealed. Prior to his arrival, the door to JonBenét's room had been closed but not locked. I obtained a police crime scene tape and adhesive tape from Sergeant Whitson's vehicle. Detective Patterson and I sealed the entrance to JonBenét's room at approximately 10:30 hours. At approximately 10:35 hours, all BPD officers, detectives, and victims' advocates cleared the Ramsey residence. The only persons remaining in the residence were John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, blank, 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 and myself. I talked with John briefly after all the officers had left. John told me that he and Patsy had been married 16 to 17 years. Patsy had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 3 years ago. Patsy recently discovered that she was free of cancer. John's adult daughter had been killed in a car accident 4 years ago. I asked John if there had been any suspicious people at his residence within the last few weeks. John told me no. I asked John if he had received any suspicious phone calls or hang-up phone calls within the last few weeks. John told me no. John Ramsey, blank, blank, and blank, and I were in the den area talking at an unknown time after 10:40 hours. I had placed my copy of the suspected ransom note on the table in the den and had asked John to review the note. I had asked John Ramsey to tell me what unusual things he detected from the reading of the note. John Ramsey said very little. John Ramsey's friends asked me my opinion of the note. I told John Ramsey's friends that the note appeared to be directed toward John Ramsey. The note also appeared to be personal as it referred to John Ramsey as John throughout the note. John Ramsey's friends made the following observations about the note. The author of the note directed the note to John Ramsey. The amount of $118,000 was an odd amount. The author of the note appeared to be somewhat educated. Since the words hints and attaché were used, the sentence, "Don't try to grow a brain, John," seemed to be a slap in the face to John Ramsey. The closure victory SBTC did not make sense. and the reference to John Ramsey being a Southerner indicated to the friends the person did not really know John Ramsey because John was originally from Michigan. I asked John if he had given a loan to anyone in the amount of $118,000. John said he had not. I asked John if he owed $118,000. John said he did not. At an unknown time, approximately between 1040 hours and 1200 hours, John Ramsey left the house and picked up the family's mail. I was not present when John left. I did witness John Ramsey opening his mail in the kitchen. Blank also left the Ramsey home. Blank left sometime after 10:15 hours. Blank told me he had also taken photos of the Christmas party held at the Ramsey's home on December 23rd. Blank left to have his film developed at a 1-hour photo lab. Blank returned within about 30 minutes to an hour. At approximately noon, Patsy relocated to the den area. Patsy lay down on the couch in the den. Blank remained with Patsy. Blank also stayed with Patsy. Blank, Blank, and Blank and John Ramsey were in the kitchen area and formal dining area of the house. Patsy asked me what we, i.e. police, were doing. I told Patsy that we were attempting to locate Blank. I also told Patsy that the FBI was involved in this investigation. Patsy had asked me these questions when I initially spoke with her. Patsy talked with me about the suspected ransom note. Patsy told me that Blank did not use the language contained within the note. Patsy explained to me that Blank did not use the words hints or attaché case. Patsy did not know why someone would ask for the amount of $118,000. Patsy said that amount had no significance to her. Patsy asked me why the author of the note had not asked for a larger sum of money, or at least a round sum of money. Patsy said the author of the note referred to John as being a Southerner. Patsy told me that anyone who knows John Ramsey knows he's not from the South. I asked Patsy when Blank was next scheduled to be at their home. Blank was due to be at the Ramsey home at 0900 hours on Friday, December 27. While I was talking to Patsy, she would repeatedly start crying. Patsy would be unable to speak. Patsy repeatedly asked, "Why didn't I hear my baby?" Patsy looked physically exhausted. Patsy would close her eyes, but was not able to rest or sleep. When I talked briefly with John Ramsey during the morning of December 26th, he was able to carry on a conversation and articulate his words. John Ramsey had smiled, joked, and seemed focused during the conversation. Patsy seemed to be much less focused when I spoke with her. Patsy seemed to have a far-off look in her expression. Patsy's thoughts were scattered, and it was difficult to get her to stay focused on one thought. Patsy would collapse in tears and repeatedly asked why she had not been able to hear her baby. There were 2 phone calls received by John Ramsey when I saw him act differently than he had all morning. When he received each of these phone calls, John stood in front of the north door located between the den and the kitchen. John looked outside during the phone call. John told the caller that JonBenét had been kidnapped. John was sobbing and had difficulty speaking. At times, John was unable to speak. I was told by friends the identity of the 2 callers. One caller was John Ramsey's son, John Andrew Ramsey. The other caller was John Ramsey's daughter, Melinda Ramsey. John Ramsey told me that his Boulder family was planning on flying to Michigan this morning. John's adult children from another marriage, John Andrew and Melinda, had taken the family's private plane from Atlanta and had flown to Minneapolis, Minnesota. John Ramsey, Patsy, JonBenét, and Burke were going to fly to Minneapolis, Minnesota and meet with John Andrew and Melinda. The 6 Ramseys were then going to fly to their summer home located in Charlevoix, Michigan. They were going to return to Boulder on Sunday, December 29. At approximately noon, I paged Detective Sergeant Mason and asked that he phone me at the cellular phone number for one of the phones at the Ramsey house. Patsy Ramsey had been repeatedly asking me for an update. At approximately 12:30 hours, I again paged Detective Sergeant Mason and asked him to phone me. I did not receive a call from either of these pages. At approximately 12:30 hours, I noticed that John Ramsey seemed to be by himself. John Ramsey was alone in the formal dining room area of the house. John Ramsey seemed to isolate himself from others. Earlier in the morning, I noticed that when John Ramsey was sitting down, he would look down and his leg would be bouncing. At an unknown time between 1230 hours and 1300 hours, I talked with blank blank. I told blank that I needed his help to keep John Ramsey's mind occupied. I suggested to blank that he and John Ramsey check the house from top to bottom, excluding JonBenét's bedroom. I suggested to blank that John Ramsey check to see if anything belonging to JonBenet had been taken or left behind. Blank told me that he had reported his daughter missing to the Boulder Police Department this past year. Blank had checked the house and found his daughter inside the house. Blank said his daughter had been hiding. Blank told me it was hard for him at that time not to be able to do anything. I then spoke to John Ramsey. I suggested to John Ramsey that he and blank check the house from top to bottom to see if anything belonging to JonBenet had been taken or had been left behind. I talked with John Ramsey in the kitchen of the house. After I had spoken to John, he immediately went to the basement door. I saw blank following John Ramsey. I then returned to the den area. The time was approximately 1300 hours. At approximately 1301 hours, I received the page to phone BPD number blank blank. There was no answer. I tried to make this call using one of the cellular phones at the house. I then returned to the den. At approximately 1305 hours, I saw blank run from the area of the basement door to the den. I heard some type of shout or scream before I saw blank. I saw blank grab the phone in the den, dial 2 to 3 numbers, then hang up the phone. Blank then ran back towards the basement door. Blank yelled for someone to call an ambulance. I followed blank to the basement door. The door to the basement was wide open. I was standing in the hallway, facing the door to the basement when I saw John Ramsey coming up the final 3 or 4 stairs. John was carrying a young girl in his arms. The young girl had long blonde hair. John Ramsey was carrying the young girl in front of him, using both of his arms to hold her around her waist area. The young girl's head was above John Ramsey's head while he was carrying her. From a distance of approximately 3 feet as John was walking up the stairs, I was able to make the following observations to this young girl. Both of her arms were raised above her head and were motionless. Her lips appeared blue. Her body appeared to have rigor mortis. There was a white string attached to her right wrist. There was a bright red mark approximately the size of a quarter at the front of her neck. The lower portion of her neck and the right side of her face appeared to have livor mortis. I told John to place the young girl's body on the rug just inside the front doorway. John did as he was instructed. The young girl was JonBenet. JonBenet appeared to have been dead for a period of time. I touched JonBenet's neck in an attempt to locate any sign that she was alive. JonBenet's skin was cool to the touch. There was dried mucus from one of JonBenet's nostrils. My face was within inches of JonBenet's face. I detected an odor of decay. John Ramsey asked me if JonBenet was alive. I don't remember the specific words John Ramsey used. I told John Ramsey that his daughter was dead. John Ramsey moaned. I told John Ramsey to go back to the den where the other persons in the house were congregated. I told John Ramsey to phone 911 and have detectives and a coroner respond. I told John Ramsey to go to Patsy. After John Ramsey left, I picked up JonBenet and carried her into the living room. I laid JonBenet on the rug located inside the living room. I noticed that JonBenet was wearing long white cotton pajama-like pants. JonBenet was also wearing a long-sleeved white cotton or knit top. JonBenet's face was turned to her right side. There were no coverings on JonBenet's feet. JonBenet's feet appeared to be white, that is, drained of color. I did not notice any marks to her feet. Shortly after I had moved JonBenet into the living room, I heard a loud, guttural moan and a wail coming from the den area of the house. The noise sounded as though it was made by a woman. John Ramsey came into the living room area approximately 1 to 2 minutes after I had sent him back to the den. As John entered the room, he asked me if he could cover up JonBenet. John grabbed a throw blanket that was lying on a chair located immediately inside the living room. John placed this blanket over JonBenet's body before I had a chance to speak. I adjusted the blanket on JonBenet's body so that her clothing was covered from her neck down. I also covered the neck area of JonBenet. I had covered the wound on JonBenet's neck with her long-sleeve shirt before John Ramsey arrived in the living room. I told John Ramsey that he could say goodbye to his daughter, but he could not move her body, touch her hands, or lower the blanket. John knelt on the floor next to JonBenét. John repeatedly referred to JonBenét as my little angel. John stroked JonBenét's hair with one of his hands. John Ramsey laid down next to JonBenét, placed an arm around her body, and made sounds as though he was crying. I did not notice any tears. John Ramsey then rolled away from JonBenét's body and went into a kneeling position. When John rolled away from JonBenét's body, he looked around towards the hallway. John Ramsey then knelt by JonBenét's body, hugged her, and called her his little angel. After approximately 5 to 10 seconds, John stopped hugging JonBenét, again looked toward the hallway. John remained kneeling near JonBenét when I looked into the hallway towards the den. I was able to watch JonBenét, John Ramsey, and the people coming from the den toward the living room. I saw Patsy Ramsey. It seemed as though Patsy was unable to walk without the assistance of someone on each side of her, holding her up. Blank, Patsy, blank, 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 and blank all came into the living room area. When Patsy saw JonBenét's body, she immediately went to her and laid on top of her. As I faced JonBenét from the hallway, John Ramsey was to the right of her body. Blank was near JonBenét's head. Patsy Ramsey was next to Blank. Blank was next to Patsy near JonBenét's feet, and Blank were also near the lower portion of JonBenét's body. Blank left the living room and went into the kitchen area. Blank seemed to be very upset. When Blank entered the living room, she was shaking and her eyes were wide. Blank grabbed onto my arm and repeatedly told me not to leave. I asked Blank to pray for JonBenét and to lead everyone in prayer. I then stood near the piano in the living room and was able to watch everyone in the living room, as well as Blank, who was still in the kitchen area. Patsy was crying and moaning while she was with JonBenét. Patsy raised herself onto her knees, lifted her arms straight into the air and prayed. Patsy said, "Jesus, you raised Lazarus from the dead. Raise my baby from the dead." At approximately 13-12 hours, there had been no officer response. There had also been no response from the coroner or the ambulance. The closet phone was a cellular phone in the kitchen. This phone was located approximately 12 feet away. I quickly walked into the kitchen, grabbed the cellular phone, and returned to the area in the hallway right outside of the living room. At phone 911, I reached dispatcher Santiago. I told the dispatcher that I needed a detective response and a coroner at my location. I identified myself by my radio number 156. Within approximately 3 to 5 minutes of this 911 phone call, I made a second 911 phone call. I again reached a dispatcher whose voice I did not recognize. I was transferred to a supervisor. I informed the male supervisor that I needed detective response, the coroner, and an ambulance at my present location. I gave my location as 755 15th Street. I told the dispatcher that I was at the scene of a homicide. Prior to making this second 911 phone call, I had seen an ambulance drive slowly northbound on 15th Street past the Ramsey residence. At approximately 13:20 or 13:25 hours, Officer Barry Weiss arrived at the Ramsey residence. Officer Weiss had responded to the first floor north door located off the caterer's kitchen. Officer Weiss had been calling out my name. I briefly met with Officer Weiss and then returned to the hallway outside the living room area. I informed Officer Weiss of the current situation. At an unknown time after JonBenét's body was found, and prior to Officer Weiss's arrival, I instructed Blank to stand guard in front of the basement door. I told Blank that no one was to enter the basement area. After Officer Weiss arrived, I met with the following BPD officers: Watch First Sergeant David Casera, Officer Alaric Morgan, Officer Rick French, Detective Bill Palmer, and Sergeant Larry Mason. Agent Ron Walker with the FBI had accompanied Sergeant Mason. Paramedics from A&R ambulance also arrived. After Officer Weiss arrived, I had requested that an ambulance respond. Patsy Ramsey appeared to be swooning, and I was concerned for her health. The paramedics did physically check Patsy Ramsey. The paramedics did not examine nor touch JonBenét. I was told that Patsy Ramsey was obviously very distraught. However, she physically did not need to have medical attention. The two paramedics cleared the scene after Patsy was checked. At 13:15 hours, I received the page from communications. The page stated that Sergeant Casera was at the front door at 875 15th Street. Sergeant Casera was unable to find me. I also received a page on my pager at approximately 13:29 hours. The page stated that my cellular 911 call had been received by Weld County. Weld County Communications did not understand me. I was instructed to call Boulder Communications Center if I needed assistance. After BPD officers arrived, everyone was cleared out of the living room. JonBenét's body was left where I had placed her. At approximately 13:40 hours, Detective Bill Palmer told me that he had overheard a phone conversation made by John Ramsey. John Ramsey was making arrangements to fly to Atlanta either that afternoon or that evening. Arrangements were made for John and Patsy Ramsey, blank, blank, blank and blank, to go to the blank residence. The blank live at blank in Boulder. At approximately 1400 hours, I received a page to phone Detective Patterson. I phoned Detective Patterson using one of the cellular phones in the kitchen. Detective Patterson told me that he was going to attempt to contact and interview Burke Ramsey. Detective Patterson asked where Burke was staying. I informed Detective Patterson Burke was at the blank residence located at blank, blank in Boulder. Blank family members were watching Burke. One of the family members at the house was blank. I cleared the Ramsey residence at approximately 14:35 hours. The Ramsey residence was vacated after John and Patsy Ramsey and their friends had left the residence. Officers cleared the residence and awaited a search warrant before returning. John Ramsey had been wearing khaki pants and a blue and white long-sleeve striped shirt when I had last seen him. Patsy Ramsey had been wearing black pants and a red turtleneck sweater when I had last seen her. There had been a paper bag containing children's clothing, which was sitting in the doorway to the den throughout most of the morning. After approximately 11 a.m., I moved the bag to the cloakroom area, which is located next to the door leading into the garage. Blank told me the clothing contained outer clothing for JonBenét and Burke. Winter ski pants, 2 winter jackets, and boots had been contained within this bag. Blank removed these items and placed them in the cloakroom area. When I had asked about doors being locked in the house, John Ramsey told me that the door leading from the garage into the house is always left unlocked. John further told me that the garage area is always secured from the outside. Before Officer Weiss left the residence on the morning of December 26, I believe he opened the door leading from the house into the garage area. I briefly saw a utility vehicle and a car. Officer Weiss told me that the car was a Jaguar. After I had cleared the Ramsey residence, I returned to the Boulder Police Department. I met with Detective James Byfield and assisted him in completing a search warrant for the Ramsey residence. I also attended a general detective briefing. When John Ramsey met with me in the living room after JonBenét's body had been found, I asked him where he had found JonBenét. John Ramsey told me JonBenét had been in the wine cellar. John Ramsey told me JonBenét had been lying underneath a blanket. John told me that JonBenét's arms had been tied. JonBenét had a piece of tape covering her mouth. John told me he removed the tape from JonBenét's mouth. John said he then grabbed JonBenét and carried her upstairs. One of the first things John told me after he came into the living room and had covered JonBenét's body was, "It has to be an inside job." John told me I was right. It had to be someone who really knew the family. John told me that no one knows about the wine cellar in the basement and therefore it had to be an inside job. Officer French briefly talked with me at the Ramsey's residence after JonBenét's body had been found. Officer French asked where JonBenét's body had been discovered. I told Officer French that John Ramsey said JonBenét had been found in the wine cellar in the basement. Officer French asked me to describe this room. I had not been downstairs and could not describe it. Officer French told me that when he did check the house, he checked the basement area. Officer French had not checked behind one door in the basement. This door had a latch on the top frame of the door. The door was latched. I briefly talked with Blank after officers arrived at the Ramsey residence after JonBenét's body had been found. I asked Blank where he was when JonBenét's body was found. Blank told me he was a few steps behind John Ramsey. John Ramsey had entered the wine cellar room located in the basement of the house. Blank was not able to see inside the room because his vision was blocked by the door. Blank heard John Ramsey cry out. I obtained the following information from the General Detective briefing held on the late afternoon of December 26th. Detective Patterson had conducted an interview with Burke Ramsey. Burke Ramsey said he and the 3 other members of his family had attended a party held at the Blank residence on December 25, 1996. The Ramseys were at the dinner party from approximately 1630 hours until about 2100 to 2130 hours. Crab was served at this dinner. John and Patsy Ramsey disciplined each of their children by talking to them. John and Patsy Ramsey do not use any corporal punishment on their children. Burke said there had been no family arguments prior to nor on December 25th. Detective Idler talked with the house guests who were staying at Blank home. The house guests told Detective Idler that John and Patsy Ramsey treat each of their children fairly. One of the house guests did say that Patsy adored JonBenét. Detective Idler was told that an adult daughter of John Ramsey's from a previous marriage had been killed in a car accident approximately 5 years ago. Detective Idler had also been told that Patsy Ramsey had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Patsy had recovered from the cancer approximately 2 years ago. Detective Idler was told that John and Patsy Ramsey had held a Christmas party at their home on December 23rd. Extra caterers had been hired to assist with this party. John Ramsey had told me that he and Patsy had hosted a Christmas party at their home for their children's friends. I thought John Ramsey told me this open house had been held on December 24th. The children who attended the party had decorated gingerbread houses. The gingerbread houses decorated by JonBenét and by Burke had been sitting on the dining room table located just south of the kitchen in the Ramsey residence. John Ramsey told me this information after I'd asked him about those 2 gingerbread houses. Blank had also talked with me about the gingerbread houses. Blank had told me that Patsy Ramsey was the only woman she knew who would allow young children to decorate their own gingerbread houses. Blank children, Blank and Blank, had also attended this Christmas gathering. Detective Idler had spoken with Blank. Blank told Detective Idler that he had searched the Ramsey house after he had arrived at the Ramsey residence earlier this morning. Blank said he had opened the door to the wine cellar. Blank was unable to locate a light switch for the wine cellar. Blank did not enter the wine cellar. Blank had said the interior of the wine cellar was dark and he did not see anything inside. Blank said the latch to the wine cellar, located at the top of the door, was secured when he checked it. Blank re-secured the latch to the wine cellar after he closed the door. The search warrant prepared by Detective Byfield was signed by Boulder County Judge Diane McDonald on the early evening of December 26, 1996. I was notified that the search warrant had been signed at approximately 2,000 hours. I responded to the Ramsey residence. Detective Very Hard Cop and I used crime scene tape and secured the exterior property of the Ramsey residence with this tape. The crime scene tape was placed along the south, east, and north borders of the Ramsey property. The crime scene tape was also attached to the 2 wooden fences located on either side of the driveway located at the rear west of the residence and alongside the alley. BPD officers had been positioned in the alley located in the rear of the residence and also at the front of the residence to ensure the security of the house. The Boulder County coroner, Dr. John Myers, was the first person to enter the Ramsey residence after the search warrant had been obtained. Dr. Myers entered the Ramsey residence at approximately 2,023 hours. Dr. Myers placed protective booties on each of his feet before he entered the residence. Dr. Myers also covered his hands with plastic gloves before entering the residence. Dr. Myers was told the location of JonBenét's body. Dr. Myers exited the residence through the front door. Dr. Myers told me he had examined JonBenét's body. Dr. Myers pronounced JonBenét dead. Dr. Myers told me he had observed ligature marks on JonBenét's neck. Dr. Myers had noted petechial hemorrhaging to JonBenét's eyes. Based on my training and experience, it is my experience that petechial hemorrhage to the given. Dr. Myers invited Dr. Sirotnak to examine JonBenét, particularly the trauma to JonBenét's blank area. Dr. Sirotnak did conduct an examination of JonBenét after the conclusion of this meeting. Detective Trujillo was going to be present for this examination. At approximately 21:30 hours, Detective Sergeant Larry Mason and I met with John Ramsey at the blank residence. Sergeant Mason and I met with John Ramsey in an office area room located in the basement of the blank residence. Other persons present in the room included John Ramsey's brother, Jeff Ramsey, blank, who introduced himself as an attorney and a stockbroker with blank located in Atlanta, GA. Dr. Blank, the physician for the Ramsey family, and Mike Pynam, who described himself as a friend of John Ramsey and also an attorney who was providing John Ramsey with advice. Sergeant Mason and I met with John Ramsey for approximately 40 minutes. The following information was learned from this meeting. I asked to speak with Patsy Ramsey. I was told by Dr. Blank that Patsy Ramsey was too medicated to talk to anyone. Dr. Blank had given Patsy Valium. John was told that there was a broken window located in the basement of his home. John told us that he had broken out a basement window approximately 4 to 5 months ago. This window was located in the room where the Christmas decorations were kept. The grate covering the window well to this window was not secured. John had been locked out of the house. John told us he had removed the grate, kicked in the basement window, and gained entrance to the house from this window. John told us he had not resecured the window, nor had he fixed the window which he had broken. Sergeant Mason had told John it would be helpful to our investigation if we could interview he and Patsy as soon as possible. Sergeant Mason requested we interview John and Patsy on Saturday morning, December 28. Dr. Both told Sergeant Mason he did not know if Patsy would be available for an interview at that time. Dr. Both said that Patsy was in a fragile emotional state and he did not want to subject her to anything which would further upset her. No definite answer was given regarding the request to interview John. I again asked John if he could think of anyone who might be a possible suspect in this investigation. John told me that he could only think of 2 persons from Access Graphics who might be considered a suspect. John had previously given me the name of one of these individuals, blank. The other person was a man who had been fired from Access Graphics approximately 3 years ago. John told me that he had talked to the person in charge of human resources at Access Graphics. John had asked if potential employees could be asked the question of whether or not they smoked. John was told this question could be asked. The male employee was asked this question. The male employee stated that he was not a smoker. After the male employee was hired, it was discovered that he was a smoker. John said the man was fired because he had lied on his application, not because he was a smoker. The man sued Access Graphics. The lawsuit was reported in a local newspaper. John told me that the lawsuit was settled. The former employee received a $15,000 settlement. John said he had not received any contact from this employee after the lawsuit had been settled. John told us that this was a difficult time of year for him. John told me that his daughter Beth had been killed in a car accident on January 8th of 1992. John also told me that this was a difficult time for Patsy. Patsy had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 2 years ago. Patsy had undergone treatment and the cancer had been removed. John Ramsey told us that he was thinking about offering a reward. John did not ask any questions about the results of JonBenét's autopsy. John told us that there would be a private memorial service for JonBenét at St. John's Presbyterian Church in Boulder on Sunday afternoon. The memorial service would be held at 1400 hours. The memorial service was not open to the public. After the conclusion of the memorial service, John and his family would be flying to Atlanta, Georgia. JonBenét's funeral was to be held on Tuesday, December 31st in Atlanta, Georgia. JonBenét was going to be buried next to her half-sister, Beth Ramsey. When Sergeant Mason and I left John, we told him we would phone him in the morning to arrange for interviews for he and Patsy. End of report.